On a quiet winter bus in New Hampshire, Gideon Voss noticed an old man protecting a wounded canine from the cold. The stranger called himself Malcolm, but his hands began to shake when Gideon revealed his late mother's watch. He knew the words engraved on the back, words no outsider should have known. 42 years earlier, Gideon's father had vanished after an industrial accident and was never seen again. But finding him alive would prove easier than facing why he had stayed away for so long. With an aging canine between them, two men would learn that coming home means little unless you have the courage to stay. After hearing their story, tell us what you would have done. And please like and subscribe to help us reach 5,000 subscribers. By the time Gideon Voss returned to Alderbrook, the snow had already covered the last tracks from his mother's funeral. The house stood at the end of a narrow road beneath the pale shoulders of the White Mountains, its cedar siding darkened by cold, and its roof carrying a smooth white burden. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The fire Amos Bell had lit that morning had burned down while Gideon was at the cemetery, leaving behind only a faint smell of ash and pine. Inside, Diane Voss had not yet become the past. Her reading glasses rested beside the armchair, one temple folded and the other left open. A blue wool blanket still held the shallow crease of her knees. In the kitchen, 3 tea bags sat in a saucer because Diane had believed anything that still possessed flavor deserved another chance. Gideon stood beneath the yellow ceiling light and listened to the refrigerator hum. He had spent more than 25 years in the United States Army and the National Guard learning how to identify different kinds of silence. There was the disciplined silence before orders were given, the watchful silence of men waiting beside a dark road, the stunned quiet after a blast when every person checked himself before looking at the others. This silence was none of those. This one had no purpose. It simply remained where a voice used to be. At 47, Gideon still looked more like a man preparing to leave than one who had finally returned. He stood 6 feet tall, lean and broad-shouldered, his movements economical, even when no one was watching. His dark brown hair was cut short along the sides, but allowed a little more length on top than regulations once permitted. A few silver strands showed at his right temple. He kept his face clean-shaven. Without a beard to soften it, the square line of his jaw and the pronounced bones beneath his eyes made him appear sterner than he felt. His nose bent slightly left from an old training injury, and his gray-blue eyes had the habit of settling first on doors, windows, and hands. He had arrived home 3 days before Diane died. She had been awake for less than an hour of that time. Gideon had sat beside her bed, still wearing the olive-gray tactical shirt from his final day of processing out, while winter light rested on the curtains. Diane had looked smaller than she had during their last video call, but her eyes had remained precise. She had pointed toward a cedar box on the dresser. "After," she whispered. He knew what she meant. After the pastor had spoken. After the neighbors had carried food into the kitchen and left it beneath sheets of foil. After Amos stopped finding reasons to remain in the driveway. After Gideon was alone enough to open whatever she had chosen not to explain. Now the cedar box sat on the kitchen table. He had already sorted through the practical contents, the house deed, tax papers, a bank statement, insurance forms, and his own birth certificate. Diane had arranged everything in labeled envelopes, making death look like another household task she did not trust anyone else to complete properly. At the bottom lay a photograph and an old mechanical watch. The photograph had faded into soft browns and winter blues. A young man stood beside a frozen lake with one hand resting on the hood of a pale truck. He had dark hair blown across his forehead and wore a canvas work jacket. His smile looked careless in a way Gideon distrusted on sight. Everett Malcolm Voss, his father. The man had disappeared in January of 1984 when Gideon was 5 years old. What Gideon remembered of him did not form a face. Memory offered smaller pieces: the smell of machine oil, a rough thumb wiping jam from his cheek, a voice singing off-key while snow struck the windows. Everything else came from other people. Everett had gone to work at the Blackstone Gorge hydroelectric site and had not returned. There had been an accident in a service tunnel, confusion over personnel lists, and several missing laborers. No body had been found. Years later, a court declared him presumed dead so Diane could settle accounts and keep the house. She had never told Gideon his father was brave. She had never called him a coward. She simply stopped speaking his name. During her final hour of clarity, Gideon had lifted the watch from the box and asked, "Do you want me to find out what happened?" Diane's eyes had rested on him for a long time. "It was the only thing he left me," she said. Then, after another breath, "Don't use it to find a hero. Use it to recognize the truth, if the truth finds you." He had wanted to ask what she meant. She closed her eyes before he could. Now Gideon turned the watch over in his palm. The leather strap was dark with age and cracked along the edges. Its hands had stopped at 4:17. He considered winding it, then decided against it. Some things should not be made to move before a person understood why they had stopped. He placed the watch inside the inner pocket of his field jacket. The house needed decisions. The roof required repair before spring. The furnace had been serviced but not replaced. Diane's clothes had to be sorted. The utility accounts needed transferring. The mail needed forwarding. Gideon made lists because lists remained obedient. By noon, he had filled 2 pages. He drove west to Lincoln to see Amos Bell, an old Army friend who had left service years earlier and built a life from snow tires, stove fuel, and practical advice. Amos's winter supply store sat between a laundromat and a narrow diner whose front windows were always fogged. Inside, shelves carried rope, hand warmers, lanterns, and boots large enough to survive northern New Hampshire. Amos stood behind the counter in an orange quilted vest. He was shorter than Gideon, thick through the chest, with a shaved head and a reddish-brown mustache beginning to silver at the ends. A carpenter's pencil rested behind his right ear, though nothing in the store appeared to need measuring. He looked up and said, "You look terrible. You sell mirrors now? Bad for business." Their handshake tightened into a brief embrace neither man mentioned afterward. Amos poured 2 coffees from a machine behind the counter. He listened while Gideon described the funeral, the house, and his plan to settle the estate before deciding where to go. "The railroad job is still open," Amos said. "The tourist line needed someone to oversee winter maintenance, switches, engines, frozen track, and equipment that did not lie about being broken." Gideon took a drink. "I remember. You'd be good at it." "That usually means no one else wants it. It means you like problems that can be fixed with tools." The statement landed closer than Amos likely intended. Gideon looked through the front window at snow blowing in bright ribbons across the road. "I haven't decided if I'm staying." Amos folded his arms. "You keep saying that like leaving is the neutral choice." Gideon set down the cup. Amos raised one hand. "I'm not telling you what to do." "You just did." "No. I told you what your sentence sounded like." That was why Gideon trusted him. Amos could place a truth on the table without demanding that anyone pick it up immediately. They ate lunch at the diner. Amos offered him a small measure of bourbon afterward, and Gideon accepted more out of ritual than desire. When the time came to leave, he looked at his truck keys and put them back into his pocket. "I'll take the bus," he said. Amos glanced at the nearly empty glass. "You could wait an hour." "I could." "But you won't." "No." Standards mattered most when no one would punish their absence. Gideon left his truck behind the store and walked to the bus station near the river. The afternoon had turned strangely bright. The clouds had thinned, and the snow reflected a pale blue light against the storefronts. Every breath tightened inside his chest. The late bus to Alderbrook was half full. Gideon took a seat midway down the aisle and placed Diane's leather gloves beside him. His field jacket remained open, revealing the old olive-gray tactical shirt beneath. The fabric had softened after years of washing. One shoulder seam had been repaired with thread slightly darker than the rest. The bus climbed north between frozen fields and walls of spruce. Gideon watched the mountains move past the glass and tried to imagine himself maintaining the railway through another winter. The thought was not unpleasant. That worried him. He had spent so many years assuming movement meant survival that the possibility of staying felt almost irresponsible. At Silver Notch, the bus pulled beneath a narrow wooden shelter. The door folded open. No one boarded. Then the driver said, "Sir, I can't let the dog on without documentation." A low murmur passed through the front seats. Gideon leaned toward the aisle. Outside stood an older man in a faded work coat. He was thin enough that the layers beneath it made his body look assembled rather than dressed. A gray beard covered most of his face, except for a rough patch of scarred skin along the left cheek. One shoulder sat lower than the other. Beside him stood a German shepherd. The dog was large, black and gold, though age had silvered the fur beneath his muzzle. His left ear stood straight, while the upper part of the right folded forward. A worn leather collar circled his neck, stitched several times with dark red thread. He held his rear right leg partly above the snow. A woman near the front covered her mouth with her scarf. "That animal smells." "He's hurt," another passenger said, though whether in sympathy or warning was unclear. The driver rubbed his forehead. "I'm not saying he's dangerous. I'm saying company policy requires a carrier or service documentation." The older man tightened his grip on a red climbing rope being used as a leash. "He won't bother anyone," he said. His voice was hoarse but controlled. The German shepherd did not look at the passengers. His amber eyes remained fixed on the man, watching every shift of his balance. Gideon stood. He did not feel noble. He felt irritated by the delay, by the driver's uncertainty, by the passengers who wanted a simple moral position from a situation involving rules, cold, and a living animal in pain. He walked forward and looked down at the dog. The shepherd's body stiffened. He did not growl. Gideon turned slightly rather than facing him head-on. "Does he bite?" The old man's eyes narrowed. They were green, brown, and exhausted. "Only when someone earns it," the driver sighed. Gideon looked at the worn rope, the dog's steady posture, and the way the older man kept his own body between the animal and the bus steps. "He's under control," Gideon said. "I'll pay any cleaning fee. They can sit in the back." "Well, that doesn't solve the policy," the driver replied. "Then put my name on the report." The driver studied him, perhaps noticing the military posture, perhaps only recognizing a man willing to make the inconvenience his own. After a moment, he nodded. "Back row. Dog stays on the floor." Gideon returned to his seat, picked up his spare canvas coat and spread it across the floor near the rear heater. The older man boarded slowly. The German shepherd followed, placing the injured leg down only long enough to keep balance. When the bus shifted beneath him, his hindquarters nearly folded. Gideon reached out instinctively. The dog turned his head so quickly that several passengers gasped. But he did not snap. He simply positioned his body against the older man's legs and stared at Gideon with a warning too disciplined to be fear. The old man lowered one hand to the dog's neck. "Easy, Banner." The name changed something in the animal. Not much. A slow blink, a release of breath. Gideon withdrew his hand. "Good name," he said. The old man glanced at him. "He came with it." They sat in the rear, the old man by the window and Gideon across the aisle. Banner lowered himself onto the canvas coat with visible effort, keeping his injured leg extended. A small patch of golden fur on his right shoulder caught the light like a flame. The bus pulled away. For several miles, no one spoke. The old man smelled of wet wool, machine oil, and wood smoke. Not pleasant, but not the nameless filth the passengers had imagined. Gideon watched his hands. The fingers were bent by age and work, the nails clean beneath the grime. On the left ring finger, a pale band of skin remained where a ring had once been. "You live near Alderbrook?" Gideon asked. The man looked out at the trees. "Near enough." "That's not an answer." "It's the one I have." Gideon almost smiled. The reply sounded too familiar. "What should I call you?" A pause. "Malcolm." He said it like a word borrowed for the afternoon. Gideon noticed Banner lift his head at the hesitation. "Gideon Voss," he said. The old man's hand stopped on the dog's collar, only for a second. Then he resumed stroking the worn leather. "Voss," he repeated. Gideon waited. Nothing followed. The bus heater rattled beneath them. Snow flashed between the trees in clean white intervals. "My mother lived in Alderbrook," Gideon said. "I'm settling her house." The man's jaw tightened beneath the beard. "Diane?" The name did not sound guessed. It sounded remembered. Gideon's body became very still. "I didn't tell you her name." Banner raised his head. The old man looked toward the front of the bus, as if measuring the distance to the door. "No," he said quietly. "You didn't." Gideon felt the weight of the watch against his inner pocket. He reached inside and drew it out. The old man saw the leather strap first. All color left the visible side of his face. His fingers slipped from Banner's collar. "Where did you get that?" "My mother left it." The man's eyes fixed on the watch. The bus, the passengers, and the winter beyond the windows seemed to fall away from his attention. He swallowed. "Is the writing still there?" Gideon turned the watch over in his palm. "What writing?" The old man's breath trembled. "The line about the light." Gideon looked down. Across the scratched metal back, almost too faint to read, were the words, "Keep one light for the road home." When he looked up again, the old man had turned toward the window. His hand shook against his knee. Banner shifted closer and placed one large front paw on the toe of the man's worn boot. The gesture was quiet, practiced, and deeply intimate. The old man covered Banner's paw with his hand. Outside, the road curved through snow-heavy pines toward Alderbrook. Gideon held the stopped watch between his fingers and looked at the scarred profile beside him. For the first time in more than 40 years, the absence his mother had carried no longer felt empty. It had a face, and it was sitting 3 feet away. The bus reached Alderbrook after dark. By then, the snow had softened into a fine, steady fall that blurred the street lamps and made the small station look farther from the town than it was. The driver opened the door, and cold air moved through the aisle. Gideon stood first. Across from him, the older man remained seated. Banner had not changed position for the last 20 minutes. The German shepherd lay on the canvas coat with his injured leg stretched away from his body, his breathing shallow and measured. Every few seconds, a tremor passed through the muscles near his hip. "You getting off?" Gideon asked. The man looked through the window at the station sign. "Alderbrook," he said, as if confirming a place he had once known by another name. "That's what it says." The man's hand moved toward Banner's collar. "Then yes." Rising took him longer than it should have. Banner pushed himself upright as soon as the man leaned forward, but the dog's hindquarters faltered. Gideon caught the back of the seat rather than the animal, giving Banner room to recover without feeling restrained. The old man noticed. He said nothing. Outside, The station consisted of a heated waiting room, a vending machine that hummed louder than necessary, and a diner across the road, with a red neon sign glowing through the snow. Gideon pointed toward it. "Food first." "I didn't ask." "No." The man's scarred cheek tightened. "You always this generous with strangers?" "I'm not convinced you are one." That ended the argument. The diner was called Millie's, though no one named Millie had worked there in years. Gideon remembered the place from childhood. 6 booths, a long counter, scratched pine walls, and a brass bell above the kitchen window. The interior smelled of coffee, fried onions, and wet coats. A waitress with tired eyes looked at Banner, then at the snow packed around his paws. "He stay under the table?" "Yes," Gideon said. The older man answered at the same time.
"If he wants."
The waitress stared at them both. Gideon chose the rear booth. Banner lowered himself beneath the table after circling once. The movement cost him. His breath caught, and a small sound escaped through his nose. The old man was down beside him immediately. "Easy, Banner." He placed one hand beneath the dog's chest and the other against the injured thigh without pressing. His fingers moved along the muscle in a pattern that looked practiced. Gideon sat across from him and watched. "You've been doing that a while." "Long enough." "How long has he been hurt?" The man kept his attention on Banner. "Depends which injury you mean." The waitress returned. Gideon ordered beef stew, bread, and coffee for both men without asking. He requested plain cooked meat for Banner if the kitchen had any. The older man waited until she left. "My name is Malcolm Reed." "You said Malcolm on the bus." "That's what people call me." "It isn't what the watch called you." For the first time since leaving the station, the man looked directly at him. Up close, his eyes were not weak. They were green-brown, weathered, but alert. The left cheek carried an old burn scar that tightened the skin near his ear. His beard grew unevenly around it. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. The truth would be efficient. A humorless breath left him. Everett Malcolm Voss. Hearing the full name spoken aloud did not produce the feeling Gideon expected. There was no sudden recognition, no inner voice announcing that the search was over. There had been no search, only a dead mother, a stopped watch, and a stranger with his father's name. Gideon leaned back. "Prove it." Everett nodded once. He did not look offended. "I can't. Not here." "Then start with what you can prove." The food arrived. Everett ate slowly, breaking the bread into careful pieces. Before touching his own stew, he placed the plain beef on a saucer beneath the table. Banner sniffed it, but did not eat. Everett's expression changed. It was slight, only a crease between the brows, but Gideon saw more fear in it than he had seen when the man gave his name. "He needs a vet," Gideon said. "He needs rest. He can't put weight on that leg. He has had worse days. That isn't a reason to wait." Everett's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "You take him into a clinic. They scan the chip. They ask who owns him. They ask where I live. Then somebody decides an old man without papers doesn't get to keep an injured dog. You don't know that. I know how decisions get made when your name doesn't fit the form." The answer came too quickly to be invented. Gideon studied him. "Where were you going tonight?" Everett looked toward the dark window. "There's a warming shelter near the old paper mill." "With a dog?" "They let him stay in the storage entrance when it's below 20. "And tomorrow?" Everett shrugged. The gesture angered Gideon more than open helplessness would have. "You came all the way back to Alderbrook without a plan." "I had a plan." "To do what?" Everett's gaze dropped to the table. "See the house?" The diner noise seemed to pull away for a moment. Gideon's voice lowered. "You knew where it was." "I remembered." "You were going there?" "Not to the door." "Why not?" Everett rubbed his thumb along the rim of the coffee cup.
I read Diane's obituary 3 weeks ago in a library outside Brattleboro. It said the service was here. It said her son had returned. Gideon felt something tighten behind his ribs. You knew I was here. I knew you might be. And you still planned to stand across the road. Everett did not deny it. Banner shifted beneath the table and tried to rise. His injured leg folded. The metal saucers scraped across the floor as the dog went down hard on one hip. Everett was beside him before Gideon could move. Banner's breathing turned fast.
His mouth opened, but no bark came. The muscles along his back quivered. Gideon crouched on the other side. "Don't touch the leg," Everett said sharply. "I'm not. Give him space." Banner's amber eyes moved between them. He did not attempt to bite. Instead, he pressed his shoulder against Everett's knee and held himself there, panting. Gideon looked at the dog's thin right hind quarter, then at the hand Everett had placed beneath his ribs. Whatever else the old man was hiding, the fear on his face was not about losing a possession. It was about losing the one creature still willing to remain beside him. "We're going somewhere that won't separate you without cause," Gideon said. Everett shook his head. "I gave you my word on the bus. I'll give it again. No one takes Banner unless he is in immediate danger and the law requires it. You don't know the law. No, but I know people who do." Everett looked at him for a long time. Then Banner made a low, exhausted sound. The argument ended there. North Passage Outreach occupied a former Methodist education building 2 streets behind the library. Gideon remembered attending a winter coat drive there as a child. Now the sanctuary had been divided into offices, a day room, and a temporary shelter for older adults during severe weather. A paper lantern glowed above the entrance. Inside, the air smelled of soup, laundry detergent, and overheated radiators. The woman at the desk introduced herself as Mara Ellison without standing. She was in her early 50s, with a sturdy frame, warm brown skin, and black hair cut into a short bob streaked with silver. Rectangular tortoiseshell glasses sat low on her nose. In front of her lay a blue file folder divided by handwritten tabs. Gideon gave her the shortest, useful version. Possible false identity, possible family connection. Elderly man without stable housing. Injured dog. Mara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at Everett. "What name do you want me to put at the top of the page?" Everett glanced at Gideon, then away. "Malcolm Reed." Mara wrote it down. "Any other name?" Silence. "Everett Malcolm Voss," he said. She wrote that beneath the first. Her expression did not change. "Good. 2 names are better than none. Now tell me every state you have lived in under either one." Everett's shoulders stiffened. Mara tapped the pencil against the file. "I am not police. I am not immigration. I do not arrest anyone, restore anyone, or forgive anyone. I help people build a record strong enough that the next office cannot pretend they never existed." Gideon saw Everett absorb the sentence. Mara continued. "Where did you last work?" "Seasonal maintenance. Vermont." "Employer?" "Different ones." "Hospital visits?" "A few." "Military service?" "No." "Social Security number?" Everett gave a bitter smile. "Depends which card." Mara did not react. "Then we will begin with both." A side door opened, and a woman in a brick-red parka stepped inside, carrying a gray medical bag. Her chestnut hair was tied low, curls escaping around her face. Freckles crossed her nose, and her posture had the easy strength of someone accustomed to lifting frightened animals larger than she was. "This is Dr. Celeste Ward," Mara said. "She runs the mobile veterinary program twice a week." Celeste looked at Banner first. She did not reach for him. Instead, she crouched several feet away and said his name after Everett provided it. "Banner?" One ear lifted. Celeste tapped 2 fingers lightly against the floor. Banner watched her hand, then looked back at Everett. "Search dog?" she asked. Everett's eyes narrowed. "Used to be." "That explains the restraint." Gideon noticed how she said it, not as praise, only observation. Celeste examined Banner slowly. She let him smell each tool before using it, and stopped whenever his breathing changed. Banner tolerated her hands until she flexed the right knee. Then his lips pulled back and a low warning vibrated through his chest. Celeste withdrew at once. "Fair," she said. Everett knelt beside the dog. Celeste looked up at him. "Old ligament rupture, significant arthritis, muscle wasting from years of compensating, possibly more than one injury." He slipped off a loading platform. "Was that the first injury?" "No." "What was?" Everett rubbed Banner's chest. "He was with a civilian search and rescue team outside Rutland. Mountain work, lost hikers, flood searches. Tore the knee on a rock field. They retired him." "Who owned him after that?" "A contractor running a labor camp. He was supposed to be transferred." "But wasn't." Everett's mouth flattened. "The camp closed. Men left. Equipment got sold. Banner was chained behind a storage building with 2 bags of feed and no plan." Gideon watched Celeste's face harden. "You took him." "I stayed until he could walk." "With what money?" Everett looked toward the floor. "The last of it." "Last of what?" Gideon asked. "Bus fare." The room became still. Gideon understood before Everett finished. "You had enough to come back." "Almost. And you spent it on him." Everett's hand remained on Banner's ribs. "He was there." The answer was not heroic. Everett did not present it as sacrifice. It was simply the reason. He had saved the creature directly in front of him and continued postponing the people farther away. Celeste stood. "He needs pain control tonight. Imaging soon, possibly surgery, though at his age and with this much degeneration, we would be treating function and comfort, not restoring him to working condition." "Will he be taken?" Everett asked. "Not by me." "Chip?" "I'll scan it with your consent, but a registration conflict doesn't decide custody by itself. Neither does poverty." Everett looked suspicious of the mercy in that sentence. Celeste added, "Neglect would matter." "What I see is delayed treatment and improvised care, but also someone who has been managing this leg carefully for years. Those are not the same thing." Gideon saw Everett lower his head. Banner was kept in the small treatment room for medication, warmth, and observation. Everett refused a bed in the shelter until Mara assured him the treatment room shared an interior window with the day room. While Celeste worked, Mara began searching public databases. The process was less dramatic than truth should have been. Misspelled names, scanned documents, dates entered in different formats, records that existed but did not speak to one another. Near midnight, Mara printed 3 pages and laid them side by side. The first was a marriage registration for Diane Keeler and Everett Malcolm Voss. The second was a personnel record from Blackstone Gorge Hydro Works. The third was an incident report dated January 1984. Everett Voss, missing after secondary tunnel collapse. Presumed deceased. Body not recovered. Mara turned another page. 4 months later, a Vermont rehabilitation facility admitted a Malcolm M. Reed. Same date of birth, similar physical injuries, different surname, one altered middle initial. Gideon read the page twice. It was not proof, but it was no longer only a story told over stew. Mara folded her hands. "I recommend a DNA test, retrieval of the original court file, and a legal review of the employment records."
I know an attorney named Naomi Sutter who handles identity restoration and old labor claims. Gideon looked at Everett. The old man sat beside the treatment room window, watching Banner sleep beneath a gray blanket. "We do the test," Gideon said. Everett did not turn. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." A pause. Then Gideon added, "But blood will only answer one question." Everett finally looked at him. "It will not make you my father." No anger crossed the old man's face, only acceptance. "I know." Celeste emerged from the treatment room and said Banner should remain overnight. Everett stood at the interior window after everyone else moved away. On the other side, Banner slept under mild sedation, his damaged legs supported by folded towels. For the first time that evening, the German shepherd was not touching him. Everett placed 2 fingers against the glass. Gideon watched from across the room. Until then, he had assumed the most dangerous possibility was that the old man might be lying well enough to enter his life. But Everett did not look like a man trying to gain a house, money, or a son. He looked like someone who had spent so many years expecting every door to close that he no longer knew what to do when one remained open.
The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning while Gideon was repairing the loose hinge on his mother's pantry door. The email came from Mara, with no introduction beyond a single sentence. "The relationship probability is consistent with biological father and son." Gideon read it once, then again. The screwdriver remained in his hand. The pantry door hung open beside him, exposing rows of canned peaches, lentil soup, and jars Diane had labeled in her narrow handwriting. Nothing in the kitchen changed. The refrigerator continued humming. Snow slipped from the roof in soft pieces. Somewhere beyond the house, a plow scraped along the main road. Gideon had expected confirmation to rearrange something inside him. It did not. Blood had answered the easiest question. The harder ones remained seated at the table. Everett was staying at North Passage Outreach, while Mara completed a health assessment and verified there was no immediate legal or safety reason Gideon should not offer temporary housing. Banner remained under Celeste's care for 2 more days, then returned with medication, a support wrap, and strict instructions against stairs. Gideon picked Everett up that afternoon. The old man carried the same olive canvas bag he had brought onto the bus. It contained 2 shirts, a change of socks, Banner's medicine, a few tools, and almost nothing that suggested he had lived 68 years. Mara walked them to the door. "Temporary means temporary," she reminded both men. "You set the conditions clearly. You follow them clearly. No one earns trust by pretending it is already there." Everett nodded. Gideon said, "I know." Mara looked at him over her tortoiseshell glasses. That answer usually means the opposite. She handed Everett a printed schedule for his follow-up appointments, then gave Gideon a second copy. Neither man thanked her warmly enough to satisfy politeness. Mara appeared pleased by that. The drive to Diane's house lasted 12 minutes. Everett watched the roadside through the passenger window. He recognized the old post office, though it had become a hardware store. He recognized the bend where a dairy barn once stood. At the entrance to Gideon's road, his breathing changed. "You can still stay at the shelter," Gideon said. "I know. This is not a test." Everett looked toward the house as it appeared beyond the trees. "Everything is a test when you have failed enough of them." Gideon parked without answering. Inside, he showed Everett the room that had once served as Diane's study. A narrow bed had been placed against the wall. The desk remained beneath the window, though Gideon had removed his mother's papers and locked them in a metal file cabinet upstairs. "The bathroom is across the hall," he said. "Kitchen is shared. Don't smoke inside. Don't go into her bedroom." Everett's eyes moved toward the staircase. "I won't." "If you leave, tell me where you're going." A pause. Everett set down his bag. "You think I'll run? I think you have experience."
The words landed cleanly. Everett did not defend himself. Banner lay outside the room, his scarred right leg stretched to one side. His head rested on his front paws, but his amber eyes followed Gideon. For the first 2 nights, the house became an arrangement of closed doors. Gideon woke before dawn, made coffee, and left Everett's portion in the pot. Everett waited until Gideon had finished breakfast before entering the kitchen. Their conversations stayed practical. Medication at 8, follow-up with Celeste on Thursday. Mara needed one more address from Vermont. The furnace filter had to be replaced. Neither man used the word father. Banner moved between them with less caution than either deserved. He slept outside Everett's room, but spent the mornings near the kitchen, where Gideon prepared his food and mixed the pain medication into warm broth. Banner accepted the bowl only after Everett gave a quiet command. On the 3rd morning, Gideon found one of Diane's brown leather gloves lying outside the study door. He assumed it had fallen from his coat pocket. The next morning, the other glove appeared in the same place. Everett stood in the doorway, looking down at it. "Your dog stealing now?" Gideon asked. "He has standards." That wasn't an answer. It was accurate. The exchange was so close to something ordinary that both men became uncomfortable. Banner lifted his head from the rug, ears uneven, as if satisfied with the result. Later that day, Gideon saw Everett working the damaged glove between his fingers, softening the stiff leather near the thumb. He did not ask permission. He also did not hide what he was doing. "Diane hated these," Everett said. Gideon looked up from the furnace panel. "She bought them. She hated breaking in new gloves." The detail struck harder than it should have. Gideon had never considered that his mother's habits existed before he was old enough to remember them. "Why do you know that?" Everett returned the glove to the table. "Because she complained for an entire winter." Gideon stared at him. Everett turned away first. That evening, Banner woke them both. A low thud came from the study, followed by the scrape of claws against the floor. Gideon reached the hallway to find Banner standing sideways across the doorway. The dog's body was rigid, his head lowered, not toward Gideon, but toward the bed. Everett was tangled in the blanket. His eyes were open, but he did not appear to see the room. "No," he said. "Move the line. Move them back." Gideon took one step forward. Banner blocked him. The dog did not growl. He simply placed his body between Gideon and the bed, leaning his weight toward the doorway despite the pain in his hind leg. "Banner," Gideon said quietly. One ear shifted toward him. Everett jerked upright, striking the wall with his shoulder. "Tunnel's moving." Gideon stopped trying to enter. He lowered himself to one knee in the hall. "Everett?" No response. "You're in Alderbrook." Banner looked back at the bed. "House on Mercer Road," Gideon continued. "2nd floor is empty. Snow outside. Furnace is running." Everett's breathing remained fast. Gideon kept his voice level. "Banner is in front of you." The dog turned his head. Everett's eyes found him. His hand reached out and closed around the worn leather collar. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then his breathing slowed. Banner remained between the two men until Everett whispered, "All right." Only then did the dog step aside. Gideon did not enter the room. He stood and went back to bed. The next morning, there was no glove outside Everett's door. Instead, Banner carried one into the kitchen and placed it on Gideon's boot. Gideon looked down at him. Banner did not wag. He simply waited until Gideon picked it up. The gesture did not feel like approval. It felt like responsibility being reassigned. A week later, Naomi Sutter came to the house. She arrived in a gray sedan with salt along the doors and carried a reddish-brown leather case under one arm. Her ash-blonde hair was cut short at the back and longer in front, one side falling near a pale blue eye. She removed her boots at the door without being asked and took the kitchen chair with the best light.
Naomi did not congratulate anyone on the DNA results. "Heredity is established," she said, opening her file. "Identity is not fully restored. Employment history is worse." She placed copies of several records on the table. North River Placement had supplied temporary workers to Blackstone Gorge and other industrial sites throughout northern New England. After the tunnel collapse, injured laborers had been transferred through contracted rehabilitation facilities. Names had been abbreviated, misspelled, or replaced by internal identifiers. "They did not erase anyone from federal existence," Naomi explained. "They made the records difficult enough to connect that no single office took responsibility." Everett sat with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug. Naomi continued. "Malcolm Reed appears in a Vermont treatment record 4 months after Everett Voss was reported missing. Same birth date, similar injuries. The facility was paid through a contractor account tied to North River." Gideon looked at Everett. "This explains it." Everett said nothing. Naomi's eyes shifted toward him. "It explains the first part." The room changed. She drew 2 photocopies from the file and placed them in front of Everett. "These are receipt logs from a labor aid organization in Brattleboro. 2 letters were delivered to Malcolm Reed. Both originated in Alderbrook." Gideon did not need to ask who sent them. The dates were 7 years after the accident. A signature appeared beneath each entry. Malcolm Reed. Everett's handwriting. "You received them," Gideon said. Everett looked at the copies. "Yes." The word was almost too quiet to count. "What did they say?" Naomi closed the file. "That conversation is not legal work." She gathered her coat and left them at the table. Gideon waited until her car disappeared down the road. Then he turned. "What did my mother say?" Everett rubbed his thumb over one of the signatures. "She said she didn't need me to come back fixed." Gideon's jaw tightened. "She said she didn't need a hero. She wanted the truth." The same language Diane had used before she died. Not identical, close enough to have come from an old wound. "And you answered?" "No." "Why?" Everett stood and walked to the window. At first he gave the reasons Gideon expected: the medication, the confusion after the accident, the false name, the fear that authorities would accuse him of fraud, debts from treatment, years of unstable work. Each explanation was plausible. None was sufficient. Gideon let him speak until the list ran out. "What happened after you got clean?" Everett's shoulders stiffened. "What happened when you were working again?" Silence. "When you could travel?" Everett turned from the window. "I came back once." Gideon felt the room narrow. "When?" "You were 17. He remembered that year. Diane had worked extra hours at the library. Gideon had been preparing to enter a military academy program. "I stood across from the house," Everett said. "There was some ceremony at the school. You came out wearing a gray uniform. Your mother fixed your collar before you got in the car." Gideon could see it, Diane's hands, the cold morning. Her embarrassment when he tried to pull away. "You saw us." "Yes." "And left." Everett's face folded inward, not with tears, but with the strain of refusing them. "You looked like you had become someone." She looked tired, but she was standing. "I thought walking back into that house would make both of you carry what I had become." "You thought?" "Yes." "You decided for us." Everett looked down. Gideon rose so quickly that the chair struck the wall. Banner came to his feet from the rug. The dog did not place himself between them. Not yet. "The company stole years from you," Gideon said. His voice remained controlled, which made it harsher. "The injury stole years. The drugs stole years. But after that, you made choices." "I know." "No. You know now because you're in the room with me. Back then, you told yourself leaving was kindness."
Everett flinched. You don't get to call abandonment a sacrifice because you were ashamed. Banner moved then. He stood in the narrow space between the kitchen and the hall, weight trembling over 3 legs. His eyes went first to Gideon, then Everett. Gideon looked at the dog and felt something in him stop before it became cruelty. He turned toward the sink. You can't stay here. Everett nodded once. I understand. I'm taking you back to North Passage. You're not going into the street. Everett went to pack. His belongings fit into the same canvas bag. When he returned with Banner's leash, the dog did not move. Come on, Everett said. Banner looked at him. The old man pulled gently. Banner remained where he was. His damaged leg began to shake. Everett immediately released the tension in the rope and crouched. All right, he whispered. I won't make you. Gideon stood near the front door, one hand on the frame. Neither man reached for the dog. Banner looked between them, breathing hard from the effort of standing. For once, no one made the decision for someone else. Everett sat on the floor beside him. After a minute, Banner lowered himself against the old man's hip. Gideon brought the car around. The drive to North Passage took place in complete silence. Everett sat in the back with Banner stretched across the seat. Gideon watched them in the mirror only when the road allowed. At the shelter entrance, Mara was waiting beneath the paper lantern. Everett opened the door, then paused. I'll be here, he said. Gideon kept both hands on the wheel. You need to tell Mara if you leave. I will. It was not forgiveness. It was an address. Gideon watched Everett and Banner enter the building. For the first time since 1984, his father had left him without disappearing. Naomi Sutter called Gideon 2 days after Everett returned to North Passage. She did not begin with a greeting. I found Jonah Pike. Gideon stood in his mother's garage with one hand resting on a rusted snowblower that had not started in 3 winters. Outside, sunlight flashed across the snow so brightly that the open doorway looked cut from white metal. Where? Bethlehem. He owns Pike Motor and Hydraulic. Did he agree to speak? He stopped answering after I mentioned Blackstone Gorge. Gideon wiped grease from his thumb with a rag. That sounds like an invitation. It is not. Naomi's voice had the flat patience of someone used to preventing angry people from damaging their own cases. You will not threaten him. You will not enter a locked room. You will not touch any document he does not voluntarily provide. I know how evidence works. You know how missions work. Evidence is more delicate and less impressed by confidence. Gideon looked at the disassembled snowblower. When are we going? I'm not. He already associates me with legal exposure. He may speak more freely to Everett. Everett doesn't want to see him. Then Everett must decide whether he wants his name restored badly enough to speak for himself. The sentence stayed with Gideon after the call ended. He found Everett that afternoon in the North Passage day room, repairing the loose handle of a donated kettle. Banner lay beneath the table with his injured leg extended, chin resting on his paws. Everett did not look up when Gideon mentioned Jonah. No? You haven't heard the question. I know the question. Mara says Jonah may have records. Mara says many things because she believes paper can be taught decency. From the desk across the room, Mara raised her pencil. Paper is innocent, she said. People misuse it. Everett tightened a screw in the kettle handle. I'm not going. Gideon remained standing. You knew him. I knew his boots. Men like Jonah walked through the tunnels checking production while the rest of us checked whether the ceiling intended to stay up. He may know who moved you. He knew enough then. The bitterness in Everett's voice was different from anger. Anger still expected an answer. This sounded older. Mara closed the file she had been reading. If you refuse, Naomi can still pursue the records, but Jonah will tell your story in whatever way protects him." Everett's hands stopped. Mara continued, more quietly. "You have spent years living inside names other people gave you. If you want Everett Voss back, you cannot keep letting everyone else describe what happened." Banner lifted his head at the silence. Everett looked down at the dog, then at the repaired kettle. "When?" "Tomorrow," Gideon said. Everett gave him a hard glance. "You already decided?" "No, I already cleared my day." That distinction did not satisfy either of them, but Everett agreed.
Bethlehem lay south through a corridor of mountains and bare hardwoods. The morning was sharp and cloudless. Snowbanks rose along the road in long blue-white walls, and smoke climbed straight from farmhouse chimneys. Everett sat in the passenger seat. Banner occupied the back, secured with a padded harness Celeste had provided. The German shepherd shifted often, unable to find a position that did not pull at his hip. Gideon drove without conversation. At the edge of town, Everett said, "Jonah had a habit of carrying 2 pens." Gideon glanced at him. One worked, one didn't. He handed the dead one to workers when they had to sign something. Why? So he could say they refused? The detail was too petty to sound invented. Pike Motor and Hydraulic occupied a low concrete building behind a fuel station. The sign above the bay doors had lost several letters, leaving PIKEMOTR visible through rust. Inside, heat and machinery pressed against them at once. A truck engine idled near one bay. An impact wrench rattled somewhere behind a partition. The air smelled of hot rubber, hydraulic fluid, and metal filings. Jonah Pike stood beside a workbench speaking to a mechanic. He was 61, broad through the middle, with closely cropped gray-white hair and a square face reddened by years of cold and engine heat. Safety glasses rested on his forehead. The top segment of his right index finger was missing, and when he noticed Gideon and Everett, he began wiping both hands on a blue shop rag, though they were already clean. "I told the lawyer I had nothing," he said. "You stopped answering," Gideon replied. That was the answer. Everett stood just inside the bay. Jonah looked at him for longer than politeness allowed. "You got old." "So did the people who left me there." The mechanic near the workbench suddenly found a reason to move to another bay. Jonah folded the rag. "You should go." A hydraulic press released behind them with a violent metallic crack. Everett flinched. The second sound came a heartbeat later as the ram returned. His body moved backward before his mind caught up. One heel slid toward the marked vehicle lane where a pickup was reversing from the adjacent bay. Banner lunged from beside him, not at the truck. The dog placed his body sideways against Everett's knees, forcing the old man to turn rather than continue backward. Banner's injured leg buckled under the effort, but he held position long enough for Gideon to grab Everett's coat and guide both of them clear. The pickup stopped. Someone shouted. Everett's breathing broke into shallow, rapid pulls. His eyes remained fixed on the hydraulic press. Gideon took him outside. The concrete step beside the office door was covered with a thin crust of snow. Everett sat because Gideon pressed one hand toward the step, not because he was ordered. Banner lowered himself against Everett's shin, panting from pain. "Look at the road," Gideon said. Everett shook his head. "Not at me. The road." A delivery van passed beyond the fuel station. "Blue van," Gideon said. 3 utility poles, red sign across the street. Everett's hands gripped Banner's collar. Gideon sat on the lower step, placing himself below Everett rather than in front of him. He breathed in slowly. 4 counts. Then out. Everett resisted the rhythm at first. Gideon did not tell him to calm down. He simply repeated the breath until Everett's lungs began matching it without permission. Banner pressed his scarred muzzle against Everett's wrist.
The episode lasted less than 3 minutes. It left all three of them exhausted. Everett stared at the snow between his boots. "You can say it." "Say what?" "But I'm not fit to do this?" Gideon looked toward the bay door. "I was going to say the press needs a warning buzzer." Everett lifted his eyes.
For once, there was no pity in Gideon's face and no demand that he recover faster, only a problem identified for what it was. The bay door opened behind them. Jonah stepped outside, carrying his jacket. "I shut the press down," he said. Everett did not thank him. Jonah remained standing. "I remember the collapse." "Good for you," Everett said. "I remember your name on the medical transfer list." The old man's fingers tightened around Banner's collar. Gideon rose, but said nothing. Jonah looked toward the road, unable to meet Everett's eyes. "North River told us several workers had left before the investigation. Said they were drifters, no family contacts, no permanent addresses. I had a wife. I know that now." "You knew then." Jonah's jaw worked. "I saw letters come through the office." Everett stood slowly. Banner rose with him, favoring the bad leg. "And you did what?" "Nothing." The word entered the cold without decoration. Jonah pulled the shop rag from his pocket and rubbed his palms again. "They had us sign separation forms, voluntary departure, abandonment of position. They said if we refused, the whole site would shut down and everyone would lose work." "So you signed?" "I had a mortgage. My wife was pregnant." Everett looked at him with something close to weariness. "You had a reason to be afraid." Jonah's shoulders lowered slightly, as if expecting mercy. Everett continued. "You did not have a reason to call your silence innocence." Jonah stopped wiping his hands. The red in his face deepened. For a moment, Gideon expected him to retreat behind anger. Instead, Jonah opened the office door. "There are papers." The office was smaller than Gideon expected. A metal desk occupied most of the floor. Tax calendars, parts invoices, and faded photographs covered the walls. Jonah unlocked a cabinet behind the desk and removed a dented green document box. "I kept copies," he said. "Not for you." Everett's expression did not change. "For myself." North River had a habit of making the lowest person on the ladder responsible when something went wrong. He placed several folders on the desk. There was an employee transfer authorization bearing Everett Voss's name, crossed out and replaced with Malcolm M. Reed. Another page listed medications issued after the collapse: morphine, oxycodone, sedatives, and a sequence of dosage increases no cautious doctor would have approved for long. A third file contained correspondence between North River and a rehabilitation facility in Vermont. One line stated that the patient had no verified family claimant. Attached behind it was a copy of a letter from Diane asking where her husband had been transferred. Gideon read the 2 pages twice. "They knew," he said. Jonah nodded. "Somebody knew." "Who?" "Regional supervisor named Charles Rusk, dead 12 years. Company counsel handled the rest." North River dissolved. Then its service contracts rolled into Granite Axis Industrial. Naomi had mentioned Granite Axis. The company still operated across New England. Jonah shut the box halfway. "You can look. You can't take anything." Gideon's jaw tightened. "We need copies. My largest maintenance contract is with Granite Axis. If I hand this over, they'll know." Everett looked around the shop, the invoices, the old desk, the humming bays beyond the wall. "How much of your income?" "More than half." Gideon heard the excuse before Jonah completed it. "You kept proof for 40 years and still need more time." Jonah turned toward him. "You think this is easy because you just arrived angry." "No. I think you made it easy for yourself every year you stayed quiet." Everett lifted one hand, not to protect Jonah,
to stop Gideon from taking over. "Let him choose," Everett said. Gideon stared at him. Everett looked at Jonah. "You were afraid then. You're afraid now."
At least call it by the right name.
Jonah's gaze dropped to the files. After a long silence, he said, "Your lawyer can come tomorrow. She can scan them here." "Will you make a statement?" Gideon asked. "I said she can scan. That wasn't the question." Jonah's mouth hardened. "I need time." Everett gave a tired nod. "So did I." The words carried no triumph. That made them heavier. On the drive back, Banner refused the food Gideon offered at a rest stop. He turned his head away from the meats and remained pressed against the rear door. Celeste examined him that afternoon. "He's hurting more," she said after checking the knee. "And stress isn't helping." Everett stood beside the table. "From the shop?" "From the shop, the shelter, the house, being separated and reunited, everyone around him speaking like a room is on fire." Gideon looked at Everett. Everett looked at the dog. Celeste crossed her arms. "He needs stabilization surgery if we want to improve comfort and function."
It will not restore the leg. At best, it gives him a better platform to stand on and slows the damage. "How much?" Gideon asked. She told him. Everett's face closed. A veterinary assistance fund could cover most of the procedure, Celeste explained, but Banner would have to enter temporary medical guardianship during surgery and rehabilitation. Everett would retain a path to full custody if he attended appointments and secured stable housing. That evening, Gideon found the transfer form on a table at North Passage. Everett had signed the wrong section, the permanent surrender box. Gideon carried the paper into the day room. "What is this?" Everett did not look up from Banner's medication chart. "The fund can take him. Temporarily. He needs more than I can give." "So you decided to disappear from his life before anyone asked you to?" Everett's face hardened. "Don't make this about you. You made it about me 40 years ago." Banner lifted his head at the rising voices. Gideon lowered his tone. "You do not get to call leaving love every time staying becomes difficult." Everett looked toward the dog. "He deserves a home." "He has one." "With a shelter resident?" "With the man he chooses to sleep beside." Mara came in from the office, read the form, and understood immediately. Celeste joined them by phone. Together, they made a different plan. The assistance fund would hold temporary medical guardianship only. Gideon would guarantee uncovered costs and provide transportation. Everett would attend rehabilitation sessions, maintain his place at North Passage, and comply with the treatment plan. No one promised he would keep Banner forever, regardless of circumstances. No one demanded he surrender him because he was poor. Everett signed the corrected form. The next morning he walked alone to Naomi's office. Gideon learned about it afterward. Everett placed Jonah's copied records on her desk and asked her to begin a formal statement. "All of it?" Naomi asked. "All I remember. Some parts may weaken your claim. They belong there." Naomi studied him. Everett rested both hands on the back of the chair. "I don't want a new file that turns me into a perfect victim." "What do you want?" "My name put back where it belongs." He looked at the first page. Not cleaned, not forgiven, just complete. Ruth Ann Keeler's bookstore stood 2 blocks from the Alderbrook bus station, squeezed between a pharmacy and a bakery that closed whenever the owner felt winter had become unreasonable. The sign above the door read Keeler and Pine, though no one named Pine had worked there in 20 years. Snow gathered along the lower edge of the front window, where faded travel books leaned beside a brass lamp and a handwritten card advertising used mysteries for $2 each. Gideon had passed the shop hundreds of times as a boy. He had never gone inside alone. A bell sounded when he opened the door. Warm air carried the smell of paper, orange oil, and old wood. Shelves rose unevenly toward the ceiling, their labels written in black ink on cream cards. Somewhere in the back, a radio played a piano piece too softly to identify. Ruth appeared from behind a stack of shipping boxes. She was 64, small but upright, with silver-white hair cut in loose waves below her ears. Round glasses with dark red frames magnified her brown eyes slightly. A bronze maple leaf pin held one side of her green wool coat closed, and a streak of blue ink marked the middle finger of her right hand. She looked at Gideon for several seconds. Then she said, "You have Diane's habit of standing in doorways as if someone may ask you to leave." Gideon closed the door behind him. "I didn't know that was a habit." Children rarely notice the things they inherit honestly. She did not hug him. He was grateful. Ruth led him to a narrow table near the rear window and poured tea into two mismatched cups. Gideon had not asked for tea, but Diane's friends belonged to a generation that treated hot water as a form of jurisdiction. Ruth sat across from him. "I heard about Everett." Of course she had. Alder Brook could keep a secret only if no one spoke, moved, parked, or changed facial expression. "What did you hear?" "That a man calling himself Malcolm Reed arrived with a German shepherd, that Mara Ellison is trying to prove he is Everett Voss, and that you have looked angry enough to frighten the snowplow driver. The DNA proved it." Ruth's fingers tightened around her cup. Not surprise. Something closer to confirmation finally becoming official. "So he is alive?" "Yes." "And Diane is not?" The sentence was not an accusation, but it settled between them like one. Gideon looked toward the shelves. "Did she know?" "No." "Did she suspect?" "For years." Ruth took off her glasses and cleaned them with the edge of her scarf. "She called hospitals, unions, contractors, churches near labor camps. She wrote to county clerks who never answered, and federal offices that answered with the wrong form. Once, she took a bus to Vermont because someone reported seeing a man with Everett's injuries working near Brattleboro." "What happened?" "She found a boarding house where he had lived under another name. He had left 6 months earlier." Gideon pictured Diane traveling alone with a folder of documents on her lap, following a rumor through winter. "She never told me." "You were 12. "I was old enough." "You were old enough to carry it. That does not mean she wanted you to." The response irritated him because it sounded like Everett deciding that absence was protection. Ruth saw it. "Do not confuse every decision made for you with the same sin," she said. "Your mother made mistakes. She also stayed." Gideon's jaw tightened. Ruth replaced her glasses. "She spent years looking. Then she stopped." "Why?" "Because searching had begun to consume the life that was still in front of her." The radio shifted to another piece. A pipe knocked once inside the wall. Ruth told him about Diane's years at the town library, first shelving books, later coordinating adult literacy classes. She spoke of evenings when Diane brought home forms for people who could not understand them, and mornings when she repaired Gideon's school uniform before opening the library. "She did not build her life around being abandoned," Ruth said. "She built it around you, her work, and whatever was still possible." Gideon looked down at his tea. All his life, he had understood his mother's endurance as a quiet form of waiting. The house, the watch, the absence of another marriage. He had arranged those details into a story without asking whether Diane had chosen a different meaning. "She never married again," he said. "No." "That sounds like waiting." Ruth's expression sharpened. "It sounds like she did not marry again." The correction landed without cruelty. People often turned women's solitude into evidence of devotion because it made their pain easier to admire. Ruth stood and walked toward a locked cabinet behind the register. From it, she removed a cream envelope folded once across the middle. Gideon recognized his mother's handwriting immediately. His name was not written on it. Neither was Everett's. Ruth kept the envelope in her hand. She wrote this 9 years ago. What does it say? I will not tell you. Then why show me? Because one day it may belong to you. Gideon reached for it. Ruth moved it out of reach. You are not ready. His eyes lifted to hers. You don't get to decide that. No, she said. Diane did. Ruth placed the envelope on the table but kept 2 fingers over it. She gave it to me with instructions. If Everett returned, or if you learned enough to begin using her memory as a weapon, I was to wait. I'm not using her as a weapon. You want her words to sentence him. Gideon pushed back from the table. He left her. Yes. He received letters. Yes. He saw us and walked away. Yes. Ruth did not defend Everett. That made her refusal harder to fight. She also knew you, Ruth continued. She knew how thoroughly you could turn duty into punishment. You would read this now looking for an order. Gideon stared at the envelope. What am I supposed to do instead? Live long enough that it becomes a letter? Ruth returned it to the cabinet. Gideon left angry. But he left without the envelope. At North Passage, Everett's identity restoration had reached its first official stage. Naomi had spent weeks collecting sworn statements, employment records, hospital entries, and the DNA results. Everett was required to disclose every name he had used, every cash job he could remember, and a partial tax number that had followed him through several seasonal employers. He had expected arrest. Instead, he received forms. Naomi explained that using an incomplete tax identifier and working under an alias created complications, but the circumstances, age of the records, and absence of deliberate financial fraud made prosecution unlikely. The law is not always merciful, she said, but it is frequently too tired to become theatrical. Everett sat across from her desk wearing the clean blue shirt Mara had found for him. His beard had been trimmed but not removed. The burn scar along his cheek remained visible, refusing improvement. Naomi slid a temporary certification across the desk. At the top was his full name, Everett Malcolm Voss. Below it appeared the phrase, Living Claimant, Pending Identity Reconciliation. Everett read it without touching the paper. Gideon stood near the window. No music swelled. No clerk apologized. The building continued producing the ordinary sounds of keyboards, phones, and radiators. Everett pointed to one word. Living. Yes, Naomi said. They have to write that? In your case. Everett lowered his head. For years, being alive had been a condition he managed privately. Now it had become an administrative fact. He picked up the paper with both hands. Gideon expected him to speak. Instead, Everett folded it carefully and placed it inside the plastic sleeve Mara had provided. That afternoon, Banner underwent surgery. Celeste had made the limits clear. The procedure could stabilize the damaged joint, reduce pain, and slow further deterioration. It would not return Banner to search and rescue condition. He would remain an old dog with an injured leg and arthritis worsened by years without proper treatment. Everett understood the words. Understanding them did not make the wait easier. He sat in the clinic lobby for 4 hours, knees apart, hands hanging loosely between them. Gideon brought coffee. Everett forgot to drink it. When Celeste finally entered, she still wore surgical scrubs beneath a white coat. Her curls had escaped their tie, and a red line crossed the bridge of her nose where the mask had pressed. The repair held, she said. He is awake, unhappy, and expressing strong opinions about everyone involved. Everett stood too fast. Celeste raised one hand. You can see him, but he will not stand today. Possibly not tomorrow. Pain control, swelling management, and patience.
Everett nodded. Patience, Celeste repeated, watching him. Not panic disguised as action. Banner lay inside a recovery pen on thick gray padding. His right hind leg had been shaved and wrapped. The missing fur made the muscle loss more visible than before. When Everett knelt, Banner lifted his head and gave a low, offended sound. I know, Everett whispered. Banner turned his face away. Celeste leaned against the frame. He may be irritable for several days. He has earned it. Do not make pain noble. Track it. She handed Everett a printed medication chart, then showed him how to check the incision, position the support sling, and help Banner relieve himself without twisting the joint. Gideon watched from the doorway. Everett asked the same question twice about dosage timing. He wrote the answer down both times.
Over the following week, Gideon visited every day. He did not take over. When Everett fumbled with the sling, Gideon waited until he was asked. When the medication alarm sounded, he let Everett prepare the dose. When Banner refused food, Everett called Celeste himself, rather than assuming the worst or quietly surrendering responsibility. Recovery was not dramatic. It was cleaning bowls, counting pills, changing bedding after accidents, waiting through hours in which nothing improved. Banner disliked the sling and distrusted the polished clinic floor. He snapped once at the air when Everett adjusted the bandage too quickly, then looked ashamed only because humans insisted on assigning shame to dogs. Everett did not retreat. Fair complaint, he said, and tried again more slowly. Gideon noticed the pattern. His father was staying through a process that offered no immediate forgiveness, no applause, and no guarantee of success. That was new. Ruth called him 8 days after their meeting. Come after closing. When Gideon arrived, the front lights were off except for the brass lamp in the window. Ruth placed the envelope on the same table. What changed? He asked. You did not come back demanding it. That's your standard? It is today. She sat, but did not watch him open the letter. Diane's handwriting began steadily and became less even near the end. She wrote that she had stopped waiting for Everett many years earlier. She had not stopped wondering, but wondering was not the same as surrendering a life. She wrote that she had never told Gideon his father was certainly dead, because certainty would have been another lie laid over an existing one. Then came the lines Ruth had protected. If Everett is alive, he does not need to be rescued from the consequences of leaving. He needs the chance to face them. Do not forgive him for me. Do not punish him for me either. I had my own life, and I lived it. Gideon paused. Below that, Diane had added, You have always believed love means carrying what other people drop. Sometimes love means leaving the weight where it belongs and remaining close enough to see whether they pick it up. He read the letter twice. It did not grant permission. It removed an excuse. The next morning, Gideon stood outside the clinic rehabilitation room. Everett had Banner in the support sling. Celeste crouched a few feet ahead, tapping 2 fingers against the rubber mat. Banner's front legs moved first. His left hind leg followed. The right touched the floor for less than a second. Then again. The dog managed to stand with weight divided unevenly across all 4 limbs. His whole body trembled. Everett's face brightened with alarm. Don't rush him, Celeste said. Banner took one awkward step, then another half step. His injured leg folded and he sank onto the mat. Everett lowered with him. For a moment, Gideon expected frustration, an apology. The old reflex to interpret failure as proof that hope had been foolish. Instead, Everett checked the sling, waited until Banner's breathing settled, and rubbed the golden patch on his shoulder. That counted, he said. Banner rested his muzzle against Everett's wrist. After several minutes, Everett adjusted his footing. Ready again? Banner did not look ready. Everett waited anyway. Gideon stood beyond the doorway with Diane's letter folded inside his jacket. His father had spent much of his life believing one failure justified disappearance. Now he remained on the floor beside an old dog who could not yet stand. The change was small. That made it believable. The hearing room had no windows. Gideon noticed that first. No view of snow, mountains, or the town beyond the state office building. Only beige walls, fluorescent lights, and a digital clock mounted above the panel table. Its red numbers changed without sound, making time appear orderly in a room built to discuss how badly it had been mishandled. Everett sat beside Naomi Sutter at the front table. He wore a pale blue shirt beneath a charcoal cardigan Mara had found at a donation center. His beard had been trimmed, and his gray hair no longer touched his collar. The changes made him look less homeless, but not more comfortable. His hands remained folded over a yellow legal pad on which he had written nothing. Gideon sat one row behind them. The old mechanical watch rested in his inner jacket pocket. He had considered leaving it at home. Bringing it felt theatrical, as though a family object might deserve the same weight as medical records and sworn testimony. In the end, he carried it, because Diane had entrusted it to him, not because the panel required it. Across the aisle sat 3 other former laborers and the relatives of 2 men who had died before their files could be reopened. One woman held a folder tied with string. Another man had brought a metal lunchbox with the name of a paper mill painted across the lid. Their stories overlapped with Everett's, but did not match it exactly. That mattered. North River Placement had not used one perfect scheme. It had relied on disorder, temporary names, subcontractors, cash advances, incomplete medical transfers, and workers too injured or poor to challenge the next form placed in front of them. The original company no longer existed. Most of its executives were dead. The insurer that inherited parts of the liability had changed names twice and occupied several floors of a glass building in Boston. Its representative at the hearing was a lawyer named Martin Cale, a narrow man in his early 50s whose dark suit fitted so precisely that Gideon found himself distrusting the tailoring before the person. Naomi had warned him against that. Bad people can dress badly, she had said. Decent people can afford suits. Concentrate on what he argues. Martin Cale's argument was simple. Too much time had passed. Records were incomplete. Witnesses had faulty memories. Everett had lived under another name, accepted cash employment, failed to file taxes correctly, and ignored opportunities to contact his family. Each point contained enough truth to be dangerous. The 3-member administrative panel entered at 9. The chair, Helena Morse, was a former labor judge with iron gray hair and a voice that made everyone sit straighter without raising volume. Beside her were a physician specializing in occupational injury and a state benefits administrator who wore half-moon glasses low on his nose. Helena began by defining the narrow purpose of the hearing. They were not deciding criminal guilt. They were not restoring lost marriages. They were not assigning monetary value to grief. They were deciding whether there was sufficient evidence to reopen portions of several denied or abandoned compensation files, and whether the successor insurer had obligations regarding medical care, record correction, and review of similarly affected workers. The limits disappointed no one more than Gideon expected. They also reassured him. A room that admitted what it could not repair might be more trustworthy than one promising justice for everything. Naomi began with the paper trail. She presented Everett's original employment record, the transfer authorization in which his name had been crossed out and replaced with Malcolm M. Reed, the medication list from the Vermont Rehabilitation Facility, and Diane's inquiry letter attached to a company note claiming there was no verified family contact. Martin objected to the use of copied records. Naomi produced the originals Jonah had finally released under subpoena. That was the first change in the room. Not a dramatic gasp, just Martin Cale removing one hand from his pen. Jonah Pike waited outside until his name was called. When he entered, he looked smaller than he had in his workshop. Without the noise of machines around him, his broad body seemed less commanding. He wore a dark work jacket over a clean shirt and carried his faded red cap in both hands. The missing tip of his right index finger showed whenever he adjusted the brim. Naomi asked him to describe his role at Blackstone Gorge. "Shift foreman," Jonah said. "Not management the way people mean it now. I assigned crews, tracked hours, and reported injuries up the chain." "Did you see Everett Voss after the collapse?" "Yes." "In what condition?" "Burned on one side, shoulder damaged, confused. They had him medicated." "Did he voluntarily resign?" Jonah looked toward Everett. "No." "Did you sign a form stating that he had abandoned his position?" "Yes." "Why?" Jonah rubbed his palms against his trousers, then stopped himself. "North River said anyone who refused would be blamed for payroll fraud and safety violations. I had a mortgage, a wife expecting our first child." Naomi did not soften. "Did you believe the form was accurate?" "No." "Why did you keep copies?" "To protect myself." "Did you keep them to help Mr. Voss?" "No." The answer moved through the room more heavily than an excuse would have. Martin Cale stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Pike, your repair shop recently lost a maintenance contract with Granite Axis Industrial, correct?" "Yes." "And Granite Axis is connected through corporate succession to North River?" "Far enough down the line that their lawyers say no and their invoices say yes." Helena Morse looked over her glasses. "Answer directly, Mr. Pike." "Yes." Martin continued. "So you now have a financial grievance against the successor company?" Jonah glanced at Gideon, then Everett. "I lost the contract after agreeing to testify." "That was not my question." "No. My answer is, I had more money before I told the truth." Martin paused. Jonah set his red cap on the witness table. The movement was small, but Gideon remembered the man hiding behind a shop rag and machinery. Here, without those objects, he appeared almost exposed. "I did not come because I became good," Jonah said. "I came because the records are real, and I signed one of the lies." Helena let the statement stand. Everett was called after lunch. The room had grown warmer by then, though Gideon could not tell whether the heating system had changed or whether too many bodies had been holding tension for too long. Everett walked to the witness chair without Banner beside him. That absence was visible in every movement. His left hand opened and closed near his thigh, searching for a collar that was not there. Naomi began with the accident. Everett described the secondary tunnel giving way, the sound of bolts tearing loose, and the pressure wave that threw him against a concrete support. He remembered waking beneath white light, then other rooms, other vehicles, and men asking him to sign papers he could not focus on. He did not remember choosing the name Malcolm Reed. He remembered being told it was easier if the names matched the transfer file. He described medication that removed pain without returning judgment, seasonal work, cash wages, and a succession of rented rooms where no one asked questions as long as he repaired what broke. Naomi asked when he understood that he could return to his family. Everett looked at the panel. "Earlier than I did." The answer changed the direction of the testimony. He told them about Diane's letters, about sobriety arriving in uneven stages, about seeing Gideon at 17 and choosing to remain across the road. Martin Cale stood before Naomi had fully sat down. "Mr. Voss, you are asking this panel to accept that a company stole your identity." "No." Martin appeared momentarily wrong-footed. Everett continued. They made it easier to lose. They did not steal every year. You voluntarily used the name Malcolm Reed for decades. Yes. You accepted employment under that name. Yes. You failed to file accurate tax records. Yes. You refused contact from your wife. Yes. And you expect the insurer to bear responsibility for consequences caused by your own decisions. Everett's shoulders drew back slightly. Gideon recognized the instinct to defend, to explain, to add pain until wrongdoing became understandable. Everett did none of that. The first years were done to me, he said. The rest were done through me. The hearing room became very quiet. Martin narrowed his eyes. That is a convenient distinction. No, Everett replied. It is an ugly one. He looked toward the panel. I was injured. I was drugged. My records were changed. People who knew my wife was searching wrote that I had no family claimant. Those things belonged to North River. His fingers tightened once against the chair. I also opened her letters and did not answer. I stood across from my house and left. Those things belong to me. Gideon felt the watch against his chest. For years, he had wanted his father to say exactly that. Hearing it did not restore anything. It simply stopped one more lie from occupying the room. Martin tried another direction. Your memory of the accident is incomplete. Yes. Your memory of medical transfers is incomplete. Yes. Then how can this panel trust the portions you claim to remember? Everett looked at Jonah's document box. Do not trust my memory where the paper is better. He pointed toward himself. Trust me only where I admit the paper cannot excuse me. The physician on the panel wrote something down. Later, Gideon was called. Naomi asked him to identify the photograph of Everett, the marriage record, and the watch. He removed it from his pocket and placed it on the table. The leather strap looked small under the fluorescent lights. Was this used to establish identity? Naomi asked. As an initial connection, not proof. How was paternity confirmed? DNA testing. When did you first learn Everett had returned to Alderbrook? When he sat beside me on a bus and recognized the inscription. Did your mother receive financial support from him after his disappearance? No. Are you requesting compensation for emotional harm suffered by you or Diane Voss? Martin looked up. Gideon answered carefully. No. Why not? He looked at the photograph of his mother included in the family file. It showed Diane at the library desk, one hand resting on a stack of returned books. Because this hearing cannot measure her life accurately. Naomi waited. Gideon continued. She spent years searching. She also spent years living. Turning all of that into a number attached to Everett would make her smaller than she was. Martin did not cross-examine for long. Perhaps there was little value in attacking a claim Gideon had refused to make. The panel recessed for 90 minutes. No one spoke much in the hallway. Jonah stood near a vending machine and drank coffee from a paper cup. Everett sat at the opposite end of the corridor with Mara. They did not approach each other. Gideon walked outside. Snow had begun falling in slow, dry flakes. Across the parking lot, people entered and left the building carrying envelopes, medical folders, and numbered forms. No one looked like a person approaching redemption. They looked tired. That seemed more honest. The panel returned shortly before 5. Helena Morse read the decision from the bench. The evidence was sufficient to reopen limited portions of Everett's claim and 4 related files. The panel found credible evidence that North River Placement had misclassified injured employees, concealed transfers, and interfered with family contact. Because of expired limitation periods and missing records, Full wage replacement and broad damages were denied. The successor insurer was ordered to fund medical evaluation and treatment connected to Everett's documented injuries, assist in correcting employment and Social Security records, and contribute to a limited settlement pool for surviving workers able to show comparable evidence. The state would also conduct a broader archival review. It was not vindication in the way stories preferred. No one was arrested. No large check appeared. Several claims remained uncertain. Everett would receive basic medical coverage, corrected work credits, and enough recognized history to qualify for a modest retirement benefit. Helena looked directly at him before concluding. This order recognizes that the record was mishandled. It does not return the years that record helped take. Everett nodded. I understand. Outside the hearing room, Naomi shook his hand. Mara checked the next appointment on her clipboard. Jonah stood apart, red cap in hand. Gideon did not embrace his father. Instead, he said, Celeste closes at 6. Everett looked at the clock. Banner. They left together. At the clinic, evening light had turned blue against the windows. Celeste met them in the rehabilitation room. Banner stood at the far end, wearing a support harness around his hips. His right leg remained stiff and thin, but he placed the paw down longer than before. Everett crouched. Banner took one step, then another. He moved past Celeste and stopped in the open space between Everett and Gideon. For a moment, he looked at neither man. Then he lowered himself carefully to the mat, his body touching both pairs of boots. Everett rested one hand on the golden fur at his shoulder. Gideon did not call it a sign. He did not call the hearing justice or the day a victory. Banner's steps came from surgery, medicine, repeated exercises, and people returning at the same hour each day. The order in Everett's folder had come from records, testimony, and several people admitting what they had done. Nothing had been restored without cost. Nothing had been restored completely. But they were all still there when the day ended. For now, that was enough. By late February, the White Mountains had begun to release winter 1 hour at a time. Snow still covered the north-facing slopes and lay deep beneath the pines, but afternoon light lingered longer over Alderbrook. Icicles softened along porch roofs. Meltwater ran beneath the crust at the edges of roads, carrying sand, pine needles, and the first dark evidence of earth. Gideon decided not to sell Diane's house. The decision did not arrive with certainty. It appeared gradually in smaller choices. Replacing the furnace instead of patching it, repairing the porch rail, accepting a delivery of firewood large enough to last another season. He kept Diane's reading chair near the window, but moved the blue blanket into a cedar chest. Her bedroom remained closed for months. Then one morning he opened the curtains and stripped the bed. It was not an erasure, it was maintenance of a different kind. The railroad hired him in January. Gideon supervised winter upkeep for the tourist line running through the northern towns, where frozen switches, worn brakes, and ice beneath the rails demanded attention before sunrise. He wore a dark green canvas coat over gray thermal shirts, carried a radio on his left chest, and spent his mornings among engines that announced their failures honestly. A loose belt squealed. A frozen coupling refused to move. Metal never called avoidance sacrifice. The work suited him. Once a week on Thursdays, he drove for North Passage outreach. Mara gave him a route, a list of names, and instructions not to improve anyone's life beyond the task written beside it. Hospital, she would say. Not an investigation. Or, Social Security office, do not reorganize their filing system. Gideon had not reorganized it. He had considered it. Everett rented the room above Jonah Pike's workshop. The room had a low ceiling, one narrow window, and pipes that complained whenever Jonah used hot water downstairs. Everett insisted on paying rent from his new retirement benefit, though the amount was small enough that neither man pretended it reflected market value. Jonah had lost the Granite Axis contract after the hearing. Other customers disappeared more quietly. Some said they did not want trouble attached to their invoices. Others simply stopped calling. The shop remained open. Everett worked there 4 days a week, repairing small motors, tool handles, and anything people believed too old to deserve professional attention. At one end of the workbench, he built simple padded braces for elderly dogs using canvas, foam, and adjustable straps approved by Celeste. The first few were poor. Celeste rejected 2, altered 3, and called the fourth not actively dangerous, which Everett accepted as praise. He also helped older workers complete forms at a folding table beside the office. His handwriting was uneven, but he understood why a blank space could feel like an accusation. When someone hesitated over a question about former names, Everett never told them it did not matter. He said, "Write all of them. Make the paper carry the confusion for once." He and Jonah did not become friends in the easy meaning of the word. They worked within 10 feet of each other. They argued about parts orders, heater settings, and whether a machine could be repaired one more time. Jonah never asked Everett to forgive him. Everett never offered. Their arrangement held because both men had stopped requiring comfort before responsibility. Banner spent most nights in the room above the shop. His rear right leg remained stiff, especially in the morning. The fur had grown back over the surgical site, but the muscle stayed visibly smaller than the left. On bitter days, he wore a soft gray support brace and accepted medication hidden in cheese with the solemn suspicion of a dog who knew medicine rarely arrived alone. He could walk without the sling now. Not far, not quickly. But he could rise from a rug by himself, cross a snowy yard, and choose where to lie without waiting for human hands to lift him. That independence changed his personality. Celeste claimed recovery had made him more opinionated. Gideon believed Banner had always possessed the opinions and had only regained the energy to enforce them. The dog's schedule was written on a white board in Jonah's office. Monday to Wednesday, Everett. Thursday, Gideon. Friday, clinic exercise. Weekends, Banner decides. The last line began as a joke. It became policy. Some Saturdays Gideon arrived at the shop and opened the passenger door, only for Banner to turn his head away and lie more firmly beside Everett's workbench. Other days, Everett brought him to Diane's house, and Banner walked directly through the front door without waiting for an invitation. No one used the phrase shared custody. It made the arrangement sound more orderly than it was. On the first anniversary of Diane's death, Gideon drove Everett to the lake shown in the photograph. The day was clear and cold. Sunlight turned the snow almost silver beneath the trees, and the frozen lake stretched toward the far ridge like a sheet of pale stone. Banner walked between them. His pace set theirs. Gideon carried the old photograph inside his coat. The watch rested in the usual inner pocket, no longer silent. A repairman in Littleton had cleaned the movement, replaced one damaged spring, and warned Gideon that the mechanism would never keep perfect time. "It loses about 4 minutes a week," the man had said. Gideon had answered, "So do most people." He did not wear the watch. Diane had given it to him, and he was not prepared to convert it into an ornament. He carried it because its weight had become familiar, and because the quiet ticking reminded him that restored was not the same as new. At the lake, Everett stopped beside a low stone wall half buried in snow. "This was the place," he said. Gideon compared the shoreline to the photograph. The pale truck was gone. Trees had grown where the open bank once curved behind Everett's younger body. "You looked happy." Everett studied the image. "I was." The answer surprised Gideon.
He had expected qualification. Men often distrusted evidence that they had once been happy, as if later suffering made it embarrassing. Everett touched the edge of the picture, but did not take it. "Your mother took that the week before I went to Blackstone Gorge." Gideon removed the watch. The polished metal caught the winter light. The leather strap remained cracked despite careful oiling. "She had the inscription made then?" Everett nodded. "She said I treated every job like a road leading somewhere better." "That sounds like criticism." It was. A small smile moved beneath Everett's beard. "She told me to leave one light for the road home." Gideon turned the watch over. "Keep one light for the road home." For years he had imagined the words as a promise between two young people. Standing beside Everett, he understood they had also contained a warning. "My mother kept that light on a long time," he said. Everett looked across the frozen water. "I know." "She didn't stand at the door forever." "No." "She had a life after you." Everett's eyes remained on the lake. "I know that, too." There was no self-pity in the answer, no attempt to transform Diane's survival into evidence that his absence had caused less harm. Gideon placed the watch back inside his coat. For the first time, they spoke about Diane without asking her memory to decide what should happen between them. She was not a judge waiting to pronounce sentence. She was not a saint whose forgiveness could be inherited. She had been a woman who searched, stopped searching, and continued living. Banner moved toward the wall and sniffed where the snow met the stone. His rear paw slipped. Everett reached instinctively, but Gideon caught the support strap first. Their hands touched above Banner's back. Neither pulled away immediately. "Easy," Everett said. It was unclear which of them he meant. Banner recovered and continued walking. That afternoon, Everett left his canvas bag at Gideon's house. It was not planned. After dinner, he stood by the front door, staring at the bag beside the radiator. "You forgot something," Gideon said. Everett looked at it. "I know." Gideon waited. Everett picked up Banner's leash but left the bag where it was. "I'll get it Thursday." The sentence was ordinary. That made it important. He was leaving something behind with a stated time to return. Gideon did not comment. On Thursday, Everett came back for it. In early March, Mara called with a transportation request. A man named Calvin Rusk had completed identity reconciliation after nearly 18 years of using an incorrect surname. He had been discharged from a hospital in Concord and needed to reach North Passage, but the final regional bus required a transfer at Silver Notch. "Can you and Everett meet him?" Mara asked. "Why both of us?" "Because Calvin is nervous around officials. You look like one, even when holding groceries. And Everett knows what it is to arrive carrying a name that does not feel secure yet." Gideon glanced across Jonah's workshop. Everett was fitting a new handle to a kettle while Banner slept beneath the table. "I'll ask." Mara made a skeptical sound. "You mean you will tell him the time?" "I've improved." "Marginally." They reached Silver Notch before sunset. The same wooden shelter stood beside the road, its roof edged with old snow. Gideon remembered the first time he had seen Everett there, thin, scarred, and holding a red climbing rope while strangers debated whether he and Banner were acceptable enough to travel. Now Everett wore a clean work coat and a dark wool cap. The scar along his cheek had not softened, nor had his beard become fashionable. He still looked like a man who belonged more naturally beside machinery than under polite lighting. Banner lay near the bench in his support brace. When the southbound bus arrived, Calvin Rusk descended last. He was 71, with a narrow chest, watery eyes, and a gray overcoat too large at the shoulders. He carried one canvas bag and a plastic folder pressed against his ribs. The folder contained the papers proving he was who he said he was. No one mocked him. No one needed to. A few passengers glanced at his worn clothes and moved their belongings closer. A man by the window placed his briefcase on the empty seat beside him. A woman offered Calvin a polite smile, but did not rise. Ordinary hesitation could isolate a person as effectively as open cruelty. Gideon stepped forward. Everett moved before him. He took Calvin's canvas bag without asking for the papers. "North Passage?" Everett said. Calvin nodded. "Everett Voss." The older man blinked at the name. "Calvin Rusk." Everett pointed toward the bus. "Seat beside me is open." Calvin looked at Banner. "He friendly?" "No," Everett said. "But he is fair." For the first time, Calvin smiled. They boarded. Gideon paid the fares while Everett settled into the rear seat. Calvin sat beside him, his plastic folder balanced carefully on his knees. Banner lowered himself beneath them, rear legs stretched into the aisle until Gideon nudged it gently inward. Gideon took the seat across from the two men. The bus pulled away from Silver Notch. Sunlight lay low across the snow, turning the road gold at the edges. Pines moved backward beyond the glass. The heater rattled under the floor with the same tired rhythm Gideon remembered. Calvin kept one hand on his folder. "Did it take long?" he asked Everett. "To fix the name?" "Yes. Long enough." "Does it feel different?" Everett considered the question. "Some days." Calvin looked disappointed. Everett added, "It feels better when somebody uses it and waits for the answer." Calvin nodded slowly. Gideon looked down at Banner. The shepherd's eyes were closed, but one ear remained turned toward Everett's voice. His breathing was deep and even. He was not the broken dog who had struggled onto the bus months earlier. He was not healed either. Both things were true. Inside Gideon's coat, the watch ticked softly. Everett looked toward the passing trees. His reflection moved across the glass, an old man layered over snow, road, and fading light. He had not regained the life he lost. Gideon had not received the father he might once have imagined. There had been no restoration grand enough to cancel absence. What they had built was smaller. Everett returned when he said he would. Gideon helped without taking command of every outcome. Banner moved between their homes and trusted both doors to open. The bus turned north toward Alderbrook. Calvin's shoulder relaxed against the seat. Everett kept the canvas bag by his boots, ready to carry it when they arrived. No one promised that every wound would close. No one claimed truth had made them innocent. But a seat had been left open for a man who needed one. And 3 lives that had once been shaped by disappearance were learning in ordinary ways how to remain. Sometimes grace does not look like getting the lost years back. Sometimes it looks like finally telling the truth, returning when you said you would, and leaving a seat open for someone who has nowhere else to go. In everyday life, we may not be able to repair every wound, but we can choose not to add another silence to it. We can show up, keep our word, and give others the dignity of an honest answer. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories about loyalty, responsibility, and second chances. May God give you the courage to face what is yours to carry, and the wisdom to stop carrying what never belonged to you.